There are undoubtedly numerous reasons and rationales for why this place of expression, these pages may remain remote in their accessibility, may persist in having a reasonably low audience, have no interest at all in increased audience and monetizing simply recording me talking. There's no virtue in that. Or becoming a success, or finding esteem or approval by how many clicks or likes. And I feel as if one of the fundamental reasons for this is that there's not a clear lineage or pathway that has brought me to a place of expressing myself in such a way as I do here. Sure, if you move along to the tab About, you'll find a brief synopsis of my life, really, and that will include allusions to experiences, personal experiences, professional experiences, academic pathways, stalling on each of these, spiritual traditions, religious traditions, humanistic traditions, the psychological, the philosophical, the emotional, the prayerful, and so on and such. It's just a description of life. Thus far, I'm currently aged 55. So I am, in fact, newly born in eldership. If I'm even born at all, you'll have to decide for yourself whether this wisdom appears to you as wisdom. It may not. Perhaps you are viewing these talks through a lens, through a way of being, seeing these talks in the first half of life. Now, of course, you can be in the first half of life. A person can be in the first half of life at the age of 80. But generally, the first half of life would be to view the world through our senses, based on our initial conditioning and socialization as a child in a culture, experiencing the psychological, the sociological, and the emotional through our parents, through our schooling, through our time frame in so-called history, and the influence of all of those. Of course, now this is the year 2022, and we're experiencing a world that I would describe as the binary age, that is an age of noughts and ones, or a digital age, or an electronic age. That the Industrial Revolution and technological advances have been so significant in the last 100 or so years, 150 years, that here we are, when we are open to more opportunities for choice, or at least the idea that there are more choices, even though we might not be able to access many of them in our short lifespans, than at any time previously in history. So here we are. So these talks are organic in nature, they are spontaneous, they derive from the accumulative experiences of life from this particular vantage point through this apparent mind as a motion of constant indivisible consciousness, and through a personality construct that has struggled with external events internally, that has attempted to derive meaning and purpose, definition, affection and approval, just as we do, certainly within the first half of life, through encounters with others and peer groups, workplaces, through suffering and difficulty, joy and ecstasy, and the chemical conundrum of life through which I've experienced absolute despair, unholy despair, and ecstatic joyfulness beyond measure that was so alluring I tried to stay in that place, and learnt much at both of those descriptions. But it is an attempt to understand, to reach understanding, and numerous experiences of failing to reach understanding. And that is, of course, a form of understanding, that this pathway, this practice, these steps that I'd taken had meaning at the time, though it was always difficult to articulate meaning out of something. Yet ultimately that meaning was insufficient, or became insufficient for where the search had then left me. So there was further searching, further meaning, another pathway, a new practice, another set of strategies and tools, another job, another relationship, another in the search to become enough, to realize enough, to recognize enough, or an enoughness that was inherent and innate and readily present, to just feel enough, the emotion of enoughness. Not just to psychologically feel enough around the people that loved me and the support group or the tribe that I was currently assigned to over the years, which again, if you turn to the About page, you'll see those listed, as alluded to earlier. But to just feel enough, just for long enough time, feeling this perspective, this corner of the human experience as a person, in inverted commas, quotation marks. In the end, the search for meaning has brought me to a current place, and my current understanding of meaning is that I don't need meaning. There is no need for meaning. Meaning is subjective. Meaning and meaningfulness is applied. There is a meaningfulness to talking that seems to have some traction in it, but ultimately these words, as will all others, pass away, just as the body and the mind does. And along the way, talking and words are something to do. I like to feel as if they are something for me to do. There's arguably a cumulative capacity to use words, and hopefully an increasing responsibility and accountability and tenacity to wait for them, without that feeling that pauses don't carry meaning themselves. Not only words are of value, not only are words of value, but the spaces between them are also of value, and who's to say perhaps of more value, perhaps not so. Yet these are notions which at the moment are somewhat sense-making, even if they don't make sense. They are counterintuitive. Out of those fruitful spaces and emptiness and beingness, out of silence, the very language of the universe, has developed a way to read emptiness, to read beingness, and to read silence, to see the shapes of silence, the form in the formless, to consider, to sit with, to chew on, to pray silently, not discursively, though that too. To embody silence, to invite silence, to retreat into beingness, into consciousness. To love the apparent moments, though there are no moments. To use times and time alone, or with others in groups, to step out of time individually or collectively. And at best, breathe. At best, the first motion of each day, of each sleep, of each dream, is the breathing function of the body, to which and as which life is glued, is sellotaped, is innately bound. Yet there are the same pauses at the top of the breathing function, at the bottom of the breathing function, where life still exists. So breathing itself is a movement that leads to a rest at both ends of its experience, of its knowing. And in terms of lineage, perhaps the need to explain one and justify one and come from one and attribute the words used in the spaces in between two items, like even mindfulness and meditation, all of those bring limits and all of those constrict the messages. The message is happening in you. It's absolutely happening in you. These are words used in the service of the unsayable. As James Finley, contemplative therapist, describes so perfectly. We're using words to point beyond the words themselves, as Franciscan Richard Ross said so beautifully. Some of my teaching has that which has been taught me. I don't claim to be a teacher or a guru or the leader of a satsang or anything other than how you perceive me, and that's on you. Much of this way of exploring meaning and expressing that exploration has come through Christian mystical tradition, the contemplative tradition of Thomas Keating, Raw, James Finley, Cynthia Bourgeot, the CAC radical lens of expressing ancient teaching, ancient wisdom, through religious tradition, the Christ consciousness, stemming out of an initial understanding and experience of Christ as a character, which our current religious world orders champion above others. Many do, but not all. There's no absolutes here. But also much experience of recovery communities, therapeutic communities, the current trend, and it is a trend, or a current way of articulating reality through the non-duality lens, which are words you'll hear me use very rarely, because I tend to be a person who finds movements limiting and assignations to tribes even more limiting as one becomes identified inside of, as a member of, and with certain titles and assignations that go with that. Though I have had those too, that's how I've been able to interpret and understand the limits of so doing. So there is no lineage. That is the lineage. There is no label with which one would like to readily identify myself. Aside from that, I have just made a movement. There has been a movement to be termed a Quaker. As a member of the Quaker community in the UK, I've been what's known as an attender for over a decade now. So I've been attending as a visiting member of the Quaker community, but in order to bump the numbers up by one apparent figure, from 22,000 to 22,001 apparent figure, have made a literal motion to be assigned to that tribe. Because right here, right now, for the moment, lineage, apparent rejection aside, that is a sense-making motion, that is a sense-making movement. So that's happening, but that's not really a thing. You won't find too much in this narrative that speaks directly of what that assignation looks like. But trust me that is in the melee, in the oeuvre of all of these attempts to articulate wisdom and the absence of lineage as a lineage, and to ultimately unpack all of the need for words and the use of words in order to experience that which using words in the service of the unsayable points to. So every single word used should be from your perception, because that's where the teaching is, in you. There is no teacher and there is no teaching here. But within you there's a perception which should ultimately find all of these words redundant, useless, and no longer necessary. But for a time, to do yourself, should they be useful to you, some amount of justice in your own search to come to your own realizations about absolute truth, over clamours for your objective truth that represents itself as, well, that's my truth and I'm sticking to it, which is no good to anybody. It's absolutely useless. But in our search for absolute truth and to find meaningfulness, if not meaning, survey these words and reject them accordingly. And in the rejection of all of them, that which remains in true Sherlock Holmesian style, in the style of negation of that which first seems true that then isn't true, once we've rejected all possibilities, what we are left with is truth. And that truth may well turn out to be, just as it currently seems to be, to this shaped body and this apparent consciousness, to be truth with a capital T in the absolute. We might call that God, we might call that love with a capital L. We don't even need the names for it, but it is self-evident and self-experiencing and cannot fail. Nothing can separate you from the love that is, or from the love of that, or the love in that, or the love ultimately as that. How beautiful, how gorgeous. Be that in this.